Welcome to a Bailiwick Express podcast. This is Focus, a deep dive into a pressing issue facing the Bailiwick of Guernsey. Thank you for joining us.
This year's Channel Islands Pride will feature references to the greatest Guernsey artist you've never heard of. If you don't know who that is, that's David Robilliard. He died in 1988 after living in London for 12 years, a victim of the AIDS crisis. Robilliard was achieving acclaimed professional success when he died in his 30s. Despite exhibitions of his work during his lifetime and since his death, and numerous books of his poems and artwork being published, I had never heard of him before this year. One man who knew him very well is Lester Carapel. Better known to many as a politician now, but he is a man with a hell of a backstory of his own. He's full of stories about his friend David, how they met as teenagers in Guernsey, and the time they spent living together in London, where they both tried to forge creative careers.
He had a 12-year career, internationally renowned as a poet and artist. And he wasn't one in a million, he was a one-off. I never knew anyone like Dave. He was driven, absolutely driven. He was all or nothing.
Yeah.
He could be the most infuriating person you've ever met in your life. And he could be the most endearing, the most compassionate, all in the same hour. He would drive you mad with something that he'd said or done. Because he was very sincere, and he was very compulsive, and sometimes he didn't think through the possible ramifications. But Dave was very trusting. He trusted anyone. He'd go into a bar or a nightclub and he'd start talking to anybody and he'd tell him his life story and he'd trust him. He was very vulnerable, very gullible. He soon got streetwise, but between the time that he was very vulnerable in the big cities, the guy from the little island in the big city, that was the time we had a few scrapes until he got streetwise.
While Lester was focused on a career in music, his friend David had always been a poet and an artist. When they first met as teenagers in Guernsey, David was too shy to share his artwork with anyone. Lester and his brothers were among the very first people who he trusted to show his work to. Over the following years, they saw David's artwork evolve, and eventually during the 1980s, Lester saw his friend achieve the professional success that many people, including myself, have only just started to learn about.
So eventually, over a course of a few months, I managed to persuade him to show me some of his poems, and they were really astounding, absolutely. Yeah. He used to nail things with just a few sentences, and I said, you've got to share these. You can't just hide them away all the time. So he said, I've even destroyed some. But I said, don't destroy any more. Yeah. You've got to share them. People want to see these. He said, do you think so? I said, yeah, well, look, they've touched me, so they're bound to touch other people. So eventually he got confidence to share a few of them. He evolved into some very graphic, in-your-face stuff. He was an observer. He was he'd sit for hours and look at people. And he'd write one line, and he'd work on it later. He'd do a sketch. Very different to what he eventually evolved into. He used to do little drawings at the table and leave them on the table. And I said, you can't leave that there. You've got to build up a portfolio, David Robilliard's art. He said, well, if you want it, my friend, take it. Eventually, I'm jumping forward a bit, he got to meet Gilbert and George.
Okay, and they were very influential on his future.
They gave him a start. Yeah. They're the ones that gave him the start.
So Gilbert and George, though, who are Gilbert and George?
Were the renowned gay artists, internationally renowned gay artists, Gilbert and George, who'd been on the scene for many, many years.
Okay, so they were already established and well-known, renowned. Yeah,
and they were touched by Dave's work. David evolved then to doing other bigger pictures. He was always wanting to do big stuff.
Yeah.
So in the end, Dave ended up doing like a 6-foot square, and there'd be some kind of slogan, some faces. He was he was a people person. He was obsessed. If he saw someone with an interesting face, or an interesting way of walking, or an interesting way of standing, he'd get that characteristic, and he'd try to get it onto one of his paintings. So he was evolving into that all the time.
My journey to find out about David Robilliard was sparked by a Facebook post shared by Liberate early in 2024. The Channel Islands-based charity supporting and empowering LGBTQ people only became aware of David Robilliard and his work last year. And the charity and its members have been on a journey of discovery about David's life and work ever since.
Ellie Jones, CEO of Liberate. We kind of stumbled across him. You'd think that if anyone out of, sort of within Guernsey, our art club, for example, might have known who he was. So we were speaking with the Guernsey museums and Mike up there, and we were talking about putting together like a deposit place for LGBT kind of history artifacts, maybe posters, from Pride or previous nightclubs or some sort of social history. And then Mike started digging into, do we have any prominent LGBT people from history? Because we'd never, again, sort of found anyone. Our colleagues in Jersey had found sort of some people, and we just thought, well, we don't have any really. And then Mike started doing like the tiniest bit of digging, and then found some documentaries on David Robilliard. And even then, I don't think we realised quite how big an artist he was. Like the Tate have got 2 of his pieces. He's had exhibitions across the globe, since his death, pre his death. And because he was, his artwork was quite controversial back then, it would probably not be seen that way now, because it would probably be seen as quite tame now. But, it's probably quite shocking. And, it did have sort of queer themes in there, or LGBT themes, which again, back in around that time, it was illegal to be gay, especially in Guernsey. When his first sort of parts were being published, I think Guernsey decriminalised homosexuality in '86. So it was about, it was quite a bit later than the UK. So, a lot of young LGBTQ people would leave Guernsey up until quite recently, really. So he moved to London and befriended Gilbert and George, who most people have kind of heard of, because I'm not very arty either, so I just assumed it was just me being ignorant of art, and then we've just stumbled across this whole world of David Robilliard, and he just sounds like the most interesting, like wonderful kind of character as well.
I think that's a really good way of putting it, actually, because he does sound really interesting. He sounds like a colourful character, and from some of the stories that Lester has told me, he sounds like the kind of person that would have been good fun to spend some time with, possibly not too long with, because as Lester told me, they were always getting into scrapes. I don't know he wouldn't tell me what all of the scrapes were, but David Robilliard does sound like a real character, a real person and a live character. He's been dead more than 30 years, getting on for 40 years, but the stories that I've heard make him still sound so alive, and that's the beauty of artwork, isn't it? We've still got this link with him.
Yeah, and I think he's sort of like, if you look at his artwork, so his artwork's based around kind of pieces of poetry, short little kind of ditties of observational humour in a lot of places. The one that sticks in my head is there's one that says something along the lines of, gloves, they're handy. And it just...
It's literally that, isn't it?
And then it's what people would see as quite simplistic, I guess, sort of, artwork based on that. But there's some really sort of poignant ones in there. And everyone we've spoken to just has been... There just seems to be this, like, outpouring of love when they talk about him. Like, it's a really positive... just love. Like, I can't really describe it any other way. Everyone's just like really speaks really fondly of him.
My brothers loved him. My mum and dad adored him. Sometimes he'd come round, he'd be a bit too much, because sometimes, this is where I'm talking about the extreme. When we used to live at the lodge, Full-on Lodge, we're at the Greyside now, and when we used to live at the lodge, my dad was caretaker. Dave would come along every day, but my dad would be out at work because he had caretaker duties, and he wouldn't see him much. So even on a Saturday, my dad used to work as his caretaker duties. On a Sunday, he'd say, "Is Dave coming round today?" And we'd say, "No.
He's been round every other day."
He's been round 6 times this week. You can have too much of a good thing. And my dad would be really upset, because he'd be, "But I haven't seen him." So you're either connected with Dave or you didn't.
Okay.
And most people I know connected with Dave in that big way, that they loved being around him.
Mm-hmm.
They loved him being around. Some people would say he got on your nerves. I could see where they're coming from, but not to the point that you'd purposely exclude him, because he'd be very hurt by that. But like I said, Dave was a one-off. He wasn't a one in a million. He was a one-off. He was like, he said to me when we first got to London, he said, "This is like being a child let loose in a sweet shop." He was going to try all the sweets, make himself sick, but he had to try all the sweets.
He was getting that professional success then while he was alive. So during the 1980s there were exhibitions.
He was heavily sponsored by Gilbert and George.
Yeah.
I can't emphasise that enough. If it wasn't for Gilbert and George, I don't know if Dave would have had the career that he's having and he's had. He was heavily sponsored by Gilbert and George. They published his first book. They set up his first exhibition.
Mm-hmm.
They introduced him to other people.
Yeah.
And who then took a chance and sponsored him for other things. In his lifetime, there were 2 books of poems published and what they called a box of poems, which was cards in a box. After he died, there was a lot more published, but in his lifetime, there was 2 books and a box of poems. But there are exhibitions as well, and he used to go along to those exhibitions, and he'd just sit there, wait for people to come in. They'd talk to him, and he'd sign pictures as they bought, and he started to sell, but not huge amounts, enough to give people and George, like Gilbert and George, confidence that, because they loved the person Dave was, but they were businessmen as well. They couldn't afford to lose money, so they sponsored another exhibition, and he started to sell, in dribs and drabs, a little bit at a time. When he came back to Guernsey, he stayed with my wife and I set him up an interview with Jim Delbridge at BBC Guernsey. And I always remember this. After the interview, at the end of it, Jim said, "So what's 1988 going to bring for Dave Robilliard?" And Dave said, "More." And Jim said, "More what?" He said, "More exhibitions, more books, more everything. I can't wait to get out. I can't wait to get started." But of course, he died in '88. He died in November '88. But he hadn't been diagnosed with AIDS at that time. So he was still very enthusiastic. As I say, I've never known a person like Dave. I could be down and out and thinking, well, we're down and out, we're in a mess here. And he'd pull something out the bag. Just like that. It was all about meeting people.
David Robilliard's death in 1988 was a tragedy of the AIDS epidemic. His life and his creative evolution as an artist both cut short. During our conversations, Lester told me that David's mum had described him as a caged bird. Guernsey was his cage, and moving to London as a young man in the 1970s allowed him to spread his wings and soar. As Ellie reminds us, he could not have lived the life he did in Guernsey as an openly gay man during that time.
I don't think it was easy to live that life probably in the UK either, like openly. Maybe in London you could have been, because it would be more acceptable. But I would imagine that in Guernsey, I don't know whether he would have been that open at the time. I think within his circle of friends and family, then it would have been known. But I don't think there was an openness sort of about it. I think once he moved to the UK and then the circles that he was moving in, and I've lived in London and experienced like the whole LGBT queer life of London, and it's very easy then to think that you're in this little bubble of acceptance and that nobody really cares, and hopefully we've got to that point now, but certainly wouldn't have been then. And then obviously the AIDS epidemic hit. and you know, destroyed any I guess positivity and forward motion of people feeling that they could be more open, because then we were just, you know, slapped with stigma and shame and fear, you know, so it was probably one of the most liberating and free times, but also probably one of the most terrifying times as well.
And actually, David Robilliard was a victim of the AIDS crisis, wasn't he? That was why he died as a relatively young man in, was it 1988 he died. So yeah, quite a long time ago now, and a victim of one of the biggest health crises the world's ever seen.
Yeah, you know, it's terrifying. I always say that, you know, I'm extremely grateful that, you know, with my generation of friends as well, you know, we were probably 10 years outside of, you know, the real height of the AIDS epidemic well, across the globe. And, you know, that could have been all of my, you know, friendship group of peers, you know, and I see friends who are a little bit older talk about those times, and it's like, it's really emotional to watch them kind of talk about, you know, friends that have died, and I just think that fear, but also the resilience that kind of popped up. I think there's one of David's pieces of artwork which, you know, to me kind of sums that up, and I might not have it completely correct, but a burst of tears at the end for a friend or something. Let me find it in here. And memory of a friend, a burst of tears from all your friends, the end. And it's just so poignant of like how, you know, we do grieve for people. You know, that's kind of, you know, a friend passes away, you have, and that's it. It
was a very, very sad affair. But Andrew, Dave's partner, came over, and it was Andrew that said, can we put poet and artist on Dave's headstone, which is a lovely touch. There were 73 wreaths from all over the world.
Wow.
And my father said, there has been nothing anywhere near. There was a mountain of wreaths, and he was caretaker here for many years.
So he saw lots of funerals.
He said you might see a dozen.
Yeah.
15. 73 wreaths from all over the world. That's how much he was loved. When you think he died in 88, how come the rest of the world has heard of him and very few people here have? I can't really answer that question.
No. Well, a few months ago I approached you, and I did not know about him. I Googled, and there's a wealth of information online. As you said,
he's all over it.
Everyone else knows about him, but, you know, I grew up in Guernsey, I work in the media, and I didn't know about him. So he has got a legacy. This isn't a new thing that, you know, we're not discovering him for the first time.
Oh.
He's been discovered decades ago, but there are a lot of Guernsey people that maybe don't know about him. His work is celebrated in many, many places. An exhibition as recently as a decade ago, 26 years after he died.
There was an exhibition which, at the time, Joanna Littlejohn was the head of the Arts Commission.
Yeah.
Ross Fossey's taken over from her, but Joanna was the head of Arts Commission at that time. And I'd been talking to Joanna, and I said, you know, it's a great shame. We really should do something to promote Dave, get his name out there. And she said, you're right, but a Dave Robilliard exhibition wouldn't probably justify all the effort. So she came up with the idea, why don't we do a combined exhibition? And David Robilliard. So it was Damon Hirst, Picasso, somebody else, and Robilliard. That's a great idea. So that's what she did.
Do you think David would have ever expected to have his name mentioned alongside artists like Picasso?
Oh, he'd have been touched. He would have been so touched.
Yeah.
I mean, and to be celebrated in the Gay Pride Week by Liberate, he'd be so touched. He was a very humble man.
Yeah.
It wasn't his ego that drove him. It was just his passion, his desire to create. Yeah, and Alpha Waring was very supportive as well. She used to run the press shop in Smith Street.
Yeah.
She dedicated a whole window to that exhibition, and she said, I'm going to feature Dave prominently.
Yeah.
Feature Dave. So people were getting behind, and okay, we're 10 years on, but it's happening again. And this looks like it's going to be the year of Dave, because there's a play being written about him. A playwright in England is writing a play. Liberate are going to celebrate him on Gay Pride Week. We're talking about a blue plaque, but that's all it is at the moment.
Yeah. And where would that go? Where was his family home in Guernsey?
Delisle Farm
Okay.
was. It's just an idea at the moment. Plaque is just an idea.
But there are ways Guernsey could celebrate this phenomenal man, as it says on his grave. Is it poet and artist?
Yeah.
So we could celebrate his work as it is celebrated elsewhere, or recognise perhaps the achievements he had in a life cut short, and the legacy he's left as well.
And it is time. It's beyond time, but at least it's happening now. Mm-hmm. And thank goodness it is, because Liberate raising the profile. I suppose in a sense, Dave's been pushed aside. I suppose in a sense, not purposely, but other things take over, don't they? And it's come to now. It's going to be the year of Dave. So that's the way I see it. And it's the time when, if there are still people in Guernsey that haven't heard of Dave by the end of the year, then perhaps it's because they don't read the paper. Perhaps it's because they're not interested in art.
Listening.
Perhaps it's because you can't. I wouldn't in any way criticise anyone for not wanting to see his work. It's personal stuff, but at least the effort would have been made. Gay Pride Week, that'll be all over all over the media.
Okay, so you've actually created here, you've got in front of us almost like an archive of some of his work, because there is a plethora actually out there. Once you start looking into David Robilliard's life and work, there is so much actually for someone who died so young. So you've created almost like an archive of some of his work. Why have you been doing this?
So we did the Artsy Front Sunday, and we decided to honour David Robilliard with that, and just kind of try and bring his artwork to the forefront. So we have an art club that runs every other week, and they've been doing a lot of replications of David's artworks, sort of fanfic or fan art. So we just decided to highlight that there. So we made this booklet that sort of tells his kind of story of moving away, the things he got published, displaying some of his artwork. He did quite a few things. So we had these little books which are in there that have got quite a lot of just scribbles and things on it. He used to do like little self-portraits, hand them to people. So lots of people have got just random kind of pieces of work, and we just wanted people to be able to kind of flip through it, I guess, and learn a little bit about him. We've had some corrections, and then some of our team have made kind of like fan art as well, so sort of like recreated his artwork.
Because actually his artwork, it is in a very distinctive style, so as you said before, a lot of it is kind of word art, so with the small poems, and then lots of kind of line drawings of self-portraits of himself and of other people. But it's kind of the fonts he used and the style he had is, once you start looking at it, it is so recognisable as, this is definitely David Robilliard. You can see it progressing
and the
through
primary
his life.
colours. Yeah, it's been really interesting, because we just kind of assumed, maybe he wasn't that big, and then so Russell Tovey made a documentary called I think it's Life is Excellent. So in 2022, the last Pride we had, the director got in touch and said Russell Tovey's over filming a documentary about David, and I'd emailed back and kind of gone, if he's over, it'd be really great if he wants to get involved in Pride. And then they never came back to us again, but I didn't know who this David was, and I just assumed they're making a documentary about something. It didn't even occur to me that it might be, an LGBT person in Guernsey, or they didn't really give me any background. And I now sort of like wish we'd followed it a little bit more and sort of, are you here? Can we talk to you? And we'd have found out a bit more then. But so they did this documentary, which then sort of, I think, brought David a bit more to the forefront. So it's a really interesting one if you want a quick, 101 of David Robilliard, of just kind of finding out a little bit about him. But Russell Tovey's, I think, is super fan.
So there is actually this interest in David Robilliard, even if there isn't much knowledge among people, say, of my generation in Guernsey. There is an interest from a wide audience elsewhere, and there's a play being written as well, which is being written locally.
Yeah, so we commissioned a play. So we were doing all sorts of things. We want to look at doing an exhibition, whether that's of original pieces of David's art, and the museum would really like to get an original piece of his art. So we want to do that. We also want to look at doing like an exhibition which is of people's memories of him. So we've had some people get in touch, for example, that used to go out with him in London. They've got lots of like a photo gallery somewhere. Leicester's got tons of sort of really early sort of drawings and things like that are a completely different style. I know there's some self-portraits exist of where David was having his portrait done by somebody else and doing one of someone else. So, people have come forward with all sorts of random pieces of artwork that we could hopefully sort of display. And then, we've commissioned a play, which is very much, sort of young artist from small town, goes to bright lights, big city, sort of David Copperfield-esque, very much sort of based around him and his experience, and obviously, being a young LGBTQ person in that era. So it's going to be exciting to see where that goes over the next sort of 12, 18 months or so.
There feels like there's growing interest in David Robilliard, but as we said, he's been dead almost 40 years. How much influence do you think he can have now as an LGBT icon, if you like?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like, we just want to highlight voices, and just, for us, it's kind of, like LGBTQ people have always existed, and sometimes because of being LGBTQ potentially, and the historic stigma, shame, etc., we have been hidden from history. It's just about bringing those people back to the forefront. It's not about David being gay, but the fact that it does appear that he's been forgotten about potentially because of the circumstances around the 80s, how people felt and potentially the subject matter of some of his artwork as well, and we've moved on a lot from then, so the time seems right to celebrate him.
You mentioned before that the Tate Gallery has got 2 of his original pieces of artwork. I mean, that's an amazing accolade. He really is an artist that has been celebrated by the art world. It just seems that maybe he hasn't been celebrated by Guernsey.
Yeah, like you look at Gilbert and George were 2 people that were super close to him and really kind of pushed his artwork, and brought him to that forefront. But in Guernsey, you would think in the museum, we would have a piece of David Robilliard art, and we don't have that yet. So hopefully we're hoping that they'll be able to find one to get. I think at the Tate as well, just in case anyone does go looking, I don't think they have everything on display all the time.
Yes.
So I know they've got 2 pieces. I don't think either of them are actually up on display at the moment. So if people give it a Google, I think on the Tate website it tells you if something's on display at the moment or not.
But there's been other exhibitions of his artwork as well.
Yep.
Nothing in Guernsey recently, but hopefully in the future there will be.
The plan is to try and do an exhibition of sorts next year. Unfortunately, these things just take time, and we don't want to rush it out for Pride. So I think we'll be working towards next year with the museum, hopefully working with like the Arts Commission and people like that, or we may be looking for corporate or private funders to get in touch with that. I mean, we need funding to do it. So if anybody is interested in funding that type of thing, then it'd be really great to get in touch.
Yeah. So as we said, David Robilliard died in 88. But he had actually been discovered before his death. This hasn't all just happened many years after he died. He'd had exhibitions. He'd had at least 1 book published, I believe.
He had 3 published
before he died.
Oh yeah, so 3. He
3 poetry collections, and he'd had exhibitions before he died. So really, it's a very tragic story. Because if it hadn't been for the AIDS epidemic, if he hadn't unfortunately been a victim of the AIDS epidemic, his career would have presumably continued to flourish. It seems like it had got off to a very good start during the 80s, at a time when you could be more open about yourself. And then, as you said before, all of that seemed to have been cut short then by the shame of the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah, I think, and it makes you think how many other people, do we not know about, from Guernsey, but just across the globe, there must be all sorts of...
All that talent and skill and just people.
Yeah, and sadly, I think we've just gone over that crossover, I believe, of he's actually been dead longer than he's been alive, sadly. But it's great that, he's coming back into people's consciousness and people want to celebrate him.
So he's not going to be forgotten, is he?
No.
There's no chance.
No. He seems like he was a pretty unforgettable guy, so, sort of cheeky and fun and caring and just seems like a really decent, fun, interesting human. So for David Robilliard wise, for Pride, so we're going to print off some of his artwork, and our art club are going to carry it in the March. So we'll have somewhere between half a dozen and a dozen different ones, and then we'll probably put them somewhere around Pride. Hopefully one of our stalls will also be doing like some artwork wise that people can like either replicate his style and things like that, but we're still working on whether the artist we're working with can do that. And then hopefully we should be doing something within the library that will sort of highlight his work, books. I think Leicester's going to potentially like loan some of the books that he has, and we'll give them the printouts that we've sort of done, and maybe some of the fan art that they've our art club have done as well. So there'll be bits of it, but we were going to kind of focus Pride around David, but it would just, we only found out about him in, I would say, like the tail end of last year. So then it was like, do we do it properly or do we rush it? So we decided to do it properly, but we really still wanted to like highlight him. I was speaking with the family, and we were just saying that I don't know why I personally feel from what I've found out about him that the idea of his artwork being paraded down the high street in St. Peter, conservative little St. Peter Port that he left, would probably tickle him incredibly.
But we don't want to reflect him as being a gay artist and poet, I think is how you said it earlier. He was an artist and poet, and he was a gay man.
Yeah, he wasn't an artist and a poet because he was gay.
Yeah.
He was an artist and a poet because he was driven by art and poetry.
Because
that was
of who
him.
he was. That was that was him.
Yeah. I'm still in touch with a couple of the guys that still promote Dave. Dave is heavily promoted outside of the island by various people, actually. There have been exhibitions held in 2014, going back again to 2014. I was invited to the launch of an exhibition of Dave's ICA in the Mall in London, a very prestigious gallery. Lots of people there, in the art world, and I was touched, and I was really honoured to be invited. And I went along, and I met a few of the people that still promote Dave now to this day, and I'm in touch with them now to this day. It's ironic that when you go on the internet, you put David Robilliard in, and you're going to get a whole raft of stuff coming up about. Some of Wikipedia's information is wrong. So sometimes Wikipedia don't quite get their facts right. So if anyone reading Wikipedia, some of the things aren't quite correct.
But you're happy, if anyone wants to talk about David Robilliard and his art and his life, you're clearly happy to talk about it. And for someone who died before the age of the internet, there's loads of examples of his artwork online. Yeah. And perhaps we will see further exhibitions.
I'm sure we will. If you run through the exhibitions that have taken place since Dave died. Well, he died in 88. There was an exhibition in 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, and the other one I was referring to, 2014. And books that have been published since his death.
Yeah.
There's a whole raft of them, you see, a whole raft on there. Apparently the Tate has got 2 of his pictures. But when I phoned the Tate, they said they hadn't, so I'll have to phone the Tate again to
see
clarify
if we can track
that.
them down.
Maybe they're in storage, maybe they're not on display. But I know that not long after he died, the Royal Festival Hall on the South Bank purchased 2 of his pictures, and they were hanging up in the reception, the foyer area. It's classic, isn't it? Somebody lives their lives in poverty, a struggling artist lives their lives in poverty, and when they die they become collectible.
And how do you think David would feel, though, about decades after his death? We're sitting here talking about him, and there have been exhibitions and books published of his work, possibly more. He is now revered and respected.
He'd be very touched, because he wasn't egotistical. He'd feel honoured, actually. I know he'd feel honoured. And it's almost to the point of not quite believing it. What, celebrating me, I always got the impression that as hard as he worked, he couldn't quite believe that he was having success.
Okay.
Couldn't quite believe, because of that lack of confidence that was in him throughout his life.
You think that persisted, that lack of confidence?
Yeah, he couldn't quite believe that people like my art, they like my poetry. Wow, this is amazing. So he'd be very touched, very honoured.
You've been listening to a Bailiwick Express podcast. If you like what you heard, please share, like and subscribe so we at Bailiwick can continue to pull apart the stories that affect you, the listener. Thank you for joining us.